Welcome back to the Sleep Detective. Tonight we embark on perhaps our most chilling psychological journey yet into the mind of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore not just the 10 brutal murders that terrorized Wichita for decades, but the extraordinary psychology that allowed a church leader, father, and community member to hide in plain sight while committing unspeakable acts. This isn't about sensationalizing evil, but about understanding the most dangerous type of predator, the one who lives among us undetected. Before we begin this comprehensive exploration, I'd love to know, put in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something fascinating about how this content connects with night owls and deep thinkers around the world. If you find value in these detailed psychological journeys, subscribing helps us continue exploring the darkest corners of human psychology and understanding how seemingly normal people can harbor such devastating secrets. Tonight's analysis will take us through the psychology of compartmentalization, the development of sadistic fantasies, and how some individuals can maintain completely separate psychological identities for decades. We'll examine how Dennis Rader's case challenges everything we think we know about recognizing dangerous individuals and provides crucial insights into how predators can function successfully in society while planning and executing horrific crimes. This is the story of the ultimate psychological chameleon. We'll trace Dennis Rader's psychological development from his seemingly normal childhood through his teenage years, exploring how early warning signs that appeared minor at the time would eventually manifest. As one of America's most calculating serial killers, we'll examine the neuroscience of compartmentalization, the psychology of control and domination, and how his brain developed the ability to seamlessly shift between his public persona and his private darkness. What makes Dennis Rader's case particularly terrifying is how it demonstrates that dangerous individuals can appear completely normal, even exemplary, to those around them. His story provides crucial insights into the psychology of deception, the development of sadistic tendencies, and perhaps most importantly, how we can better recognize subtle warning signs that might prevent future tragedies. This analysis will help us understand not just what Dennis became, but how predators develop the ability to hide among us. Our journey begins in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, where a baby boy was born into what appeared to be a normal, middle-class American family. From the outside, Dennis Lynn Rader's childhood seemed unremarkable, perhaps even ideal. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, subtle psychological patterns were developing that would eventually create one of the most methodical and calculating killers in American history. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, to William and Dorothea Rader in Pittsburgh, Kansas. Unlike many serial killers whose childhoods are marked by obvious trauma and abuse, Dennis appeared to grow up in a stable, working-class family. His father worked for Kansas Gas and Electric, his mother was a homemaker, and he was the eldest of 4 boys. This apparent normalcy is what makes his case so psychologically fascinating and terrifying. It challenges our assumptions about what creates a killer. The Rader household was described by neighbors and family friends as typical for 1952 America. William Rader was a steady provider who worked hard to support his family, while Dorothea was an attentive mother who was active in the community. The family attended church regularly, participated in neighborhood activities, and appeared to embody the American dream. However, psychological analysis suggests that beneath this surface normalcy, subtle dynamics were shaping Dennis's developing psyche in ways that would prove catastrophic. From an early age, Dennis displayed what psychologists now recognize as early warning signs of antisocial personality development. Though these signs were subtle enough to be overlooked or dismissed as normal childhood behavior, he was described as a quiet, well-behaved child who rarely caused trouble for his parents or teachers. However, This apparent good behavior masked an internal world that was developing along dangerous lines, characterized by increasing needs for control and dominance. One of the earliest indicators of Dennis's psychological trajectory was his relationship with animals. While he appeared to be a normal child in most respects, he began displaying concerning behavior toward small animals around age 8. He would capture birds, cats, and other small creatures, not for the typical childhood curiosity about nature, but for the sense of power and control it gave him. This behavior escalated gradually, with Dennis finding increasing satisfaction in having complete control over helpless living beings. The psychology behind this early animal cruelty is crucial to understanding Dennis's later development. When children harm animals, it often indicates problems with empathy development and impulse control. More specifically, it can signal the emergence of what psychologists call sadistic tendencies deriving pleasure from the suffering of others. For Dennis, these early experiences with controlling and harming animals provided his first taste of the power dynamics that would eventually drive his human victims. What made Dennis's case particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize these disturbing behaviors from his public persona even as a child. He learned early how to present himself as normal and well-adjusted while privately engaging in behaviors that would have alarmed adults if they had been discovered. This ability to maintain separate psychological identities, one public and acceptable, one private and disturbing, became his most dangerous skill. Dennis's school performance was average to above average, and he was generally well liked by teachers and classmates. He participated in normal childhood activities, had friends, and showed no obvious signs of the psychological disturbance that was developing beneath the surface. This ability to function normally in social settings while harboring dark impulses is characteristic of what psychologists call successful psychopaths, individuals who can navigate society effectively while lacking normal empathy and moral constraints. The family's religious involvement played a complex role in Dennis's psychological development. The Raders were active members of their local church, and Dennis was raised with traditional Christian values emphasizing morality, service to others, and personal responsibility. However, rather than providing a moral foundation that prevented antisocial behavior, the religious environment seems to have taught Dennis valuable lessons about presenting a socially acceptable facade while concealing his true nature. During his elementary school years, Dennis began developing what would become a lifelong pattern of fantasy life that was far more complex and disturbing than his outward behavior suggested. He spent increasing amounts of time alone, constructing elaborate internal scenarios involving power, control, and domination. These fantasies initially focused on scenarios where he had complete authority over others, reflecting his growing psychological need for control and his emerging sadistic tendencies. The development of these fantasy patterns is psychologically significant because it represents the beginning of what would eventually become his detailed murder scenarios. In his private mental world, Dennis was rehearsing power dynamics, control mechanisms, and domination scenarios that would later manifest in his actual crimes. The fact that these fantasies developed during what appeared to be a normal childhood makes his case particularly instructive for understanding how dangerous individuals can emerge from seemingly healthy environments. Dennis's relationship with his parents and siblings appeared normal on the surface, but psychological analysis suggests subtle dynamics that may have contributed to his development. His father was described as somewhat distant and authoritarian, while his mother was protective but not particularly warm. Dennis seemed to receive adequate care and attention, but there may have been a lack of deep emotional connection that contributed to his difficulty developing normal empathy and attachment patterns. As the eldest child, Dennis was given responsibilities and expectations that may have contributed to his developing need for control. He was expected to set a good example for his younger brothers and to help maintain order in the household. While these are normal expectations for an older sibling, for Dennis they may have reinforced his natural tendencies toward dominance and control, providing early validation for his psychological need to have power over others. The social environment of 1950 Kansas also played a role in shaping Dennis's psychological development. The emphasis on conformity, traditional gender roles, and maintaining appearances provided a perfect environment for someone learning to hide antisocial tendencies behind a facade of normalcy. Dennis learned early that success and acceptance came from presenting the right image, regardless of one's internal reality. By age 10, Dennis had already developed many of the psychological patterns that would characterize his adult life. He had learned to compartmentalize his disturbing impulses, present a socially acceptable facade, and derive satisfaction from exerting control over helpless beings. Most importantly, he had discovered that he could engage in concerning behavior without detection if he was careful about maintaining his public image. The absence of obvious trauma or abuse in Dennis's childhood is what makes his case so psychologically important. It demonstrates that dangerous antisocial personalities can develop even in apparently healthy family environments, suggesting that some individuals may have innate predispositions toward these behaviors that emerge regardless of their circumstances. This challenges our understanding of criminal development and highlights the importance of recognizing subtle warning signs. Dennis's early academic and social success provided him with valuable lessons about how to function effectively in society while concealing his true nature. He learned that intelligence, conformity, and careful attention to social expectations could provide excellent camouflage for someone with antisocial tendencies. These lessons would serve him well throughout his life, allowing him to maintain his facade for decades while planning and executing horrific crimes. The religious and moral education Dennis received during these formative years had a paradoxical effect on his development. Rather than providing genuine moral constraints, it taught him the language and behavior of morality without instilling the underlying empathy and conscience that make moral behavior authentic. He learned to speak and act like a moral person while remaining fundamentally amoral in his private thoughts and desires. Perhaps most chillingly, by age 12, Dennis had already begun to understand that his internal world was different from that of other people, and that revealing his true thoughts and desires would result in rejection and punishment. This realization led him to become increasingly skilled at deception and manipulation, abilities that would eventually make him one of the most successful predators in criminal history. As Dennis entered adolescence, the psychological foundation for his later crimes was already firmly established. He had developed the ability to compartmentalize his personality, maintain a socially acceptable facade, and derive satisfaction from exerting control over helpless beings. Most importantly, he had learned that careful attention to his public image could provide perfect camouflage for even the darkest private impulses. The transition from childhood to adolescence would bring new challenges and opportunities for Dennis's developing antisocial personality. The hormonal changes and social pressures of teenage years would intensify his existing psychological patterns while providing new outlets for his growing need for control and domination. The stage was set for the emergence of the predator who would eventually terrorize Wichita for decades. The seemingly normal childhood of Dennis Rader serves as a chilling reminder that dangerous individuals can emerge from any background, and that the absence of obvious warning signs does not guarantee safety. His case demonstrates the importance of understanding subtle psychological indicators and recognizing that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal on the surface. Understanding Dennis's early psychological development is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in others and potentially preventing future tragedies. His case shows us that the development of antisocial personality can be a gradual process that begins early in life, and that intervention might be possible if we learn to recognize the subtle warning signs that preceded his later crimes. The foundation established during Dennis Rader's childhood would prove remarkably durable, providing the psychological structure that would support his double life for decades. The quiet, well-behaved child who secretly tortured animals would eventually become the church leader who bound, tortured, and killed 10 innocent people while maintaining the perfect facade of respectability and moral authority. As we prepare to explore Dennis's psychological evolution during his teenage years, we can see how these early patterns created the foundation for everything that would follow. The apparently normal child was already developing the compartmentalization skills and control needs that would eventually make him one of America's most calculating and successful serial killers. As Dennis Rader entered adolescence in the late 1950s, the psychological patterns established during his childhood began to intensify and evolve in increasingly dangerous directions. The hormonal changes, social pressures, and developing sexuality of teenage years provided new outlets for his existing control needs, while his growing intelligence allowed him to become even more sophisticated in concealing his true nature from those around him. During his early teenage years, Dennis's academic performance remained solid, and he continued to present himself as a well-adjusted, responsible young man. Teachers described him as quiet but reliable, someone who completed assignments on time and rarely caused disruption in class. This continued success in maintaining his public facade was crucial to his psychological development, as it reinforced his understanding that careful attention to social expectations could provide perfect camouflage for his private impulses. The onset of puberty brought significant changes to Dennis's internal landscape, particularly in how his control needs began to intersect with developing sexual impulses. What had previously been focused primarily on animals and fantasy scenarios began to evolve toward more complex and disturbing patterns involving human subjects. His private fantasy life became increasingly elaborate and specific, incorporating elements of bondage, torture, and killing that would later manifest in his actual crimes. Dennis's social relationships during high school appeared normal on the surface, but psychological analysis reveals patterns that were distinctly different from typical teenage development. While he had friends and participated in social activities, his relationships lacked the genuine emotional connection that characterizes healthy adolescent friendships. Instead, he seemed to view social interactions as opportunities to practice his deception skills and study normal human behavior that he could then mimic. The development of his sexual identity during these years was particularly complex and disturbing. Unlike typical adolescent sexual development, which involves learning about intimacy, connection, and mutual pleasure, Dennis's sexuality became increasingly focused on control, domination, and the infliction of fear. His sexual fantasies consistently involved scenarios where he had complete power over helpless victims, revealing the deep connection between his sexual impulses and his sadistic tendencies. Dennis's involvement in school activities and community organizations during his teenage years provided valuable training in maintaining his public persona while concealing his true nature. He participated in Boy Scouts, church youth groups, and school clubs, learning to present himself as a model young man while privately developing increasingly violent fantasies. These experiences taught him how to use social institutions and community involvement as tools for maintaining his facade. The family dynamics during Dennis's teenage years continued to appear normal, but his relationship with his parents and brothers was becoming increasingly superficial. While he maintained appropriate behavior and fulfilled his responsibilities as the eldest son, his emotional connection to his family was minimal. He learned to provide the responses and behaviors they expected while keeping his true thoughts and feelings completely hidden. During his high school years, Dennis began to develop what would become his signature psychological skill, the ability to study and mimic normal human emotions and responses. He became an acute observer of how people behaved in various situations, learning to recognize and replicate appropriate emotional responses even though he didn't genuinely experience them himself. This skill would prove invaluable throughout his life, allowing him to maintain relationships and social connections despite his fundamental lack of empathy. The religious environment that had been part of Dennis's upbringing took on new significance during his teenage years. Rather than providing moral guidance that might have redirected his developing antisocial tendencies, his involvement in church activities became another venue for practicing his deception skills. He learned to speak the language of faith and morality with convincing sincerity while remaining fundamentally unmoved by the underlying spiritual or ethical principles. Dennis's academic interests during high school began to reflect his growing fascination with control and power dynamics. He was drawn to subjects like history and political science, particularly content involving war, conflict, and the exercise of authority. His teachers noted his particular interest in military history and law enforcement, interests that would later play important roles in his adult life and criminal activities. The development of his planning and organizational skills during these years was remarkable and deeply concerning. Dennis began to approach his private interests with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized his public achievements. He started keeping detailed records of his fantasies, developing complex scenarios and methodologies that demonstrated both his intelligence and his growing commitment to eventually acting on his violent impulses. Dennis's part-time jobs during high school provided important insights into his developing psychology. He was consistently described as reliable, punctual, and hardworking by employers, reinforcing his reputation as an exemplary young man. However, these work experiences also provided him with opportunities to observe people in vulnerable situations and to practice the manipulation skills that would later serve him as a predator. The social environment of late 1950s and early 1960s Kansas continued to provide ideal conditions for Dennis's psychological development. The emphasis on conformity, respect for authority, and maintaining proper appearances created a culture where his ability to present a perfect facade was highly valued and rarely questioned. His community's trust in appearances over substance allowed him to operate without suspicion, even as his private world became increasingly dark. Dennis's dating experiences during high school were notable for their apparent normalcy and his ability to maintain appropriate behavior even in intimate situations. He had several girlfriends and was generally considered a good catch by both the young women he dated and their parents. However, these relationships were characterized by his emotional detachment and his tendency to view his partners as objects to be controlled rather than as genuine emotional connections. The graduation from high school marked a crucial transition point in Dennis's psychological development. By age 18, he had successfully maintained his facade for his entire adolescent period while privately developing increasingly sophisticated and violent fantasies. He had learned to navigate complex social relationships, maintain authority figures' approval, and present himself as an ideal young man while harboring thoughts and desires that would have horrified anyone who discovered them. Dennis's decision to enlist in the United States Air Force immediately after high school graduation was psychologically significant. The military environment appealed to his need for structure, hierarchy, and clearly defined power relationships. It also provided him with an opportunity to leave his hometown and test his ability to maintain his facade in new environments with different people who had no preconceptions about him. The Air Force experience from 1966 to 1970 proved to be formative in Dennis's psychological development. The military's emphasis on following orders, attention to detail, and maintaining proper appearance aligned perfectly with his existing psychological patterns. He excelled in the structured environment, earning commendations for his performance and further reinforcing his understanding that success came from careful attention to expectations and maintaining proper behavior. During his military service, Dennis was stationed in various locations, including Alabama, Texas, and eventually overseas. These experiences provided him with exposure to different cultures and social environments while allowing him to practice his deception skills with new groups of people. His ability to quickly establish himself as a reliable, trustworthy individual in each new assignment demonstrated the sophistication of his manipulative abilities. The military training Dennis received had unintended consequences for his developing criminal psychology. Instruction in tactics, surveillance, and operational security provided him with skills that would later prove invaluable in planning and executing his crimes. His access to information about investigative techniques and law enforcement procedures gave him insights that would help him avoid detection for decades. Dennis's relationships with fellow service members followed the same pattern as his earlier social connections, apparently normal on the surface, but lacking genuine emotional depth. He was well liked and respected by his peers and superiors, but these relationships were based entirely on his carefully constructed persona rather than authentic connection. His ability to maintain this facade even in the close quarters and high-stress environment of military life demonstrated the remarkable sophistication of his psychological deception. The overseas deployment provided Dennis with exposure to different cultural attitudes toward authority, violence, and social control. These experiences broadened his understanding of power dynamics and provided him with new perspectives on how societies function. Some of these insights would later influence his approach to selecting victims and evading detection in his criminal activities. During his military service, Dennis's private fantasy life continued to evolve and become more detailed. The structured environment and regular schedule of military life provided him with ample time for mental planning and scenario development. His fantasies became increasingly specific and realistic, incorporating technical knowledge and operational planning that demonstrated his growing commitment to eventually acting on his violent impulses. The completion of his military service in 1970 marked another crucial transition in Dennis's psychological development. He had successfully maintained his facade through 4 years of military life, earning an honorable discharge and the respect of his superiors. This experience provided him with confidence that he could function successfully in any environment while concealing his true nature, a lesson that would prove devastatingly accurate in the decades to come. As Dennis prepared to return to civilian life, the psychological foundation for his later crimes was essentially complete. He had developed sophisticated deception skills, learned to navigate complex social and professional environments, and gained technical knowledge that would aid his criminal activities. Most importantly, he had spent years refining his ability to appear completely normal while harboring increasingly violent and detailed criminal fantasies. The young man who returned to Kansas in 1970 was far more dangerous than the teenager who had left for years earlier. Dennis Rader had evolved from someone with concerning tendencies into a fully formed predator with the skills, knowledge, and psychological preparation necessary to begin acting on his violent impulses while maintaining the perfect facade that would allow him to operate undetected for decades. The period from 1970 to 1974 marked Dennis Rader's transition from fantasy to reality, representing one of the most psychologically significant phases in his development as a serial killer. This was when decades of careful planning, fantasy development, and skill acquisition finally culminated in his first steps across the threshold from imagined violence to actual criminal behavior. Understanding this transition is crucial for recognizing how predators move from preparation to action. Upon returning to civilian life in Kansas, Dennis initially appeared to be following a completely normal trajectory. He enrolled at Wichita State University, pursuing studies in administration of justice, a choice that was both psychologically revealing and strategically brilliant. His academic focus on law enforcement and criminal justice provided him with formal education in investigative techniques, forensic procedures, and legal processes that would prove invaluable in evading detection throughout his criminal career. The psychology behind Dennis's choice of academic major reveals important insights into his developing criminal mindset. Rather than viewing law enforcement as a deterrent to criminal behavior, he approached it as an intellectual challenge to be understood and overcome. His studies provided him with detailed knowledge of how crimes were investigated, how evidence was collected and analyzed, and what mistakes typically led to criminal apprehension. This knowledge would become one of his greatest advantages as a predator. During his college years, Dennis's public persona continued to evolve in directions that enhanced his ability to operate without suspicion. He was perceived as serious, studious, and goal-oriented, someone with clear career aspirations in public service. His professors and classmates saw him as exactly the type of person who should be working in law enforcement or security, never suspecting that he was using his education to become a more effective criminal. The transition from military structure to civilian freedom created new psychological pressures for Dennis. Without the rigid schedule and clear hierarchy of military life, he was forced to create his own structure while managing his increasingly intense criminal fantasies. This period required him to develop new levels of self-control and planning as he began to seriously consider acting on impulses he had been nurturing for years. Dennis's first criminal acts were not his murders, but rather a series of what psychologists call stepping stone behaviors, criminal activities that allowed him to test his skills, build confidence, and gradually escalate toward more serious crimes. These early acts included breaking and entering, theft, and voyeuristic activities that provided him with opportunities to practice his operational skills while satisfying some of his control and domination needs. The psychology of these preliminary crimes is crucial to understanding how serial killers develop their methodology. Each successful criminal act provided Dennis with valuable feedback about his planning abilities, his capacity to avoid detection, and his emotional response to crossing legal and moral boundaries. These experiences served as both training exercises and psychological conditioning, gradually desensitizing him to criminal behavior while building his confidence. Dennis's breaking and entering activities during this period were particularly psychologically significant. Unlike typical burglars who focus primarily on stealing valuable items, Dennis was more interested in the experience of violating others' private spaces and exerting control over their environment. He would often spend considerable time in victims' homes, going through personal belongings, and sometimes rearranging items or taking seemingly worthless objects that had psychological rather than monetary value. The voyeuristic aspects of his early criminal behavior revealed important insights into his developing sexual pathology. Dennis derived intense satisfaction from observing people without their knowledge or consent, particularly when they were in vulnerable states such as sleeping, bathing, or engaging in intimate activities. This behavior satisfied his need for control and domination while allowing him to study potential victims and refine his understanding of their habits and vulnerabilities. During this period, Dennis also began what would become a lifelong pattern of stalking behavior. He would select individuals who interested him and conduct extensive surveillance, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and developing detailed knowledge of their daily lives. This stalking behavior served multiple psychological functions. It satisfied his control needs, provided intellectual stimulation through the planning process, and allowed him to feel powerful and superior to his annoying targets. The escalation from fantasy to actual criminal behavior required Dennis to overcome significant psychological barriers. Most people have internal mechanisms that prevent them from acting on violent or antisocial impulses, even when they experience them. Dennis's ability to cross these psychological thresholds reveals the extent to which his moral development had been compromised during his formative years and the sophistication of his rationalization mechanisms. Dennis's employment during this period played a crucial role in his criminal development. After completing his studies, he found work in various security-related positions, including time as a security guard and later as an alarm system installer. These jobs provided him with legitimate access to homes and businesses, detailed knowledge of security systems, and insights into how people protect themselves, all information that would prove invaluable in planning his crimes. The psychology of Dennis choosing security-related employment reveals his sophisticated understanding of camouflage and access. By positioning himself as someone whose job was to protect people from criminals, he created the perfect cover for his own criminal activities. His employers and clients trusted him with their security because his professional role made him appear to be the opposite of a threat. During his work as an alarm installer for ADT Security Services, Dennis gained unprecedented access to potential victims' homes and detailed knowledge of their security measures. He could observe family routines, note vulnerabilities in home security, and even disable or modify alarm systems if necessary. This legitimate access eliminated many of the risks typically associated with criminal surveillance and planning. The period leading up to his first murder was characterized by increasingly intense fantasy activity and what psychologists call rehearsal behaviors. Dennis would drive by potential targets' homes, sometimes multiple times per day, mentally rehearsing his planned attacks and refining his methodology. These rehearsals served to build his confidence while allowing him to identify and solve potential problems before attempting his crimes. Dennis's selection of the Otero family as his first murder victims reveals important insights into his psychological state and criminal methodology. The family consisted of parents and 2 young children, a target selection that suggested Dennis was ready to cross the ultimate threshold from property crimes to murder. His choice of a family rather than an individual victim also revealed his desire for maximum control and his sadistic interest in creating fear and suffering. The psychological preparation for his first murder involved months of planning and mental rehearsal. Dennis had to overcome not only moral barriers against killing, but also practical concerns about evidence, witnesses, and escape routes. His ability to methodically work through these challenges while maintaining his normal daily routine demonstrates the remarkable compartmentalization skills he had developed over decades. The morning of January 15, 1974, marked the moment when Dennis Rader finally crossed the threshold from fantasy to reality. After years of preparation, planning, and gradual escalation through lesser crimes, he was ready to commit his first murders. The psychological transformation required to move from imagining violence to actually implementing it represents one of the most significant moments in his criminal development. Dennis's approach to the Otero house that morning was characterized by the methodical planning and attention to detail that would become his signature. He had studied the family's routines, identified the optimal time for his attack, and prepared the tools and materials he would need. This level of preparation reflects both his intelligence and his deep psychological commitment to the crime. The actual commission of his first murders represented the culmination of decades of psychological development and criminal preparation. Every aspect of Dennis's personality, from his compartmentalization skills to his technical knowledge to his sadistic impulses, came together in this moment. The successful completion of the crimes without immediate detection provided him with validation that his years of preparation had been effective. The psychological impact of crossing this threshold cannot be overstated. Once Dennis had proven to himself that he could successfully plan and execute murders without detection, the psychological barriers that might have prevented future crimes were permanently removed. The first murders transformed him from someone who fantasized about killing into someone who knew he could kill successfully whenever he chose to do so. The immediate aftermath of the Otero murders revealed important aspects of Dennis's psychological response to his crimes. Rather than experiencing guilt, remorse, or psychological trauma, he felt a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. The murders had fulfilled his fantasies while demonstrating his superiority over both his victims and the law enforcement officials who would investigate the crimes. Dennis's ability to return to his normal routine immediately after the murders demonstrates the sophisticated compartmentalization skills he had developed. Within hours of killing 4 people, he was back at work, interacting normally with colleagues and customers, showing no external signs of the momentous psychological threshold he had just crossed. This ability to seamlessly transition between his criminal and civilian personas would prove crucial to his long-term success as a predator. The success of his first murders also validated Dennis's belief in his own intellectual superiority and his ability to outwit law enforcement. When the crimes were discovered and the investigation began, he was able to observe the police response while maintaining his position as a concerned community member. This perspective provided him with valuable insights into investigative procedures while reinforcing his confidence in his ability to avoid detection. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from his first murders was complex and multifaceted. Beyond the immediate gratification of acting on his violent fantasies, he also experienced satisfaction from the intellectual challenge of planning and executing the crimes, the sense of power and control over his victims, and the knowledge that he had successfully deceived everyone around him about his true nature. The period immediately following the Otero murders was psychologically crucial for Dennis's future development as a serial killer. The successful completion of his first major crimes without detection provided him with confidence to continue killing while establishing patterns and methodologies that would characterize his future crimes. The threshold had been crossed, and there was no psychological pathway back to a non-violent existence. Following the successful completion of the Otero family murders, Dennis Rader entered a new phase of his criminal development characterized by the systematic refinement of his methodology and the evolution of increasingly sophisticated operational procedures. This period, spanning from 1974 through the late 1970s, reveals how intelligent predators learn from experience and continuously improve their techniques to maximize success while minimizing risk of detection. The psychological impact of his first successful murders cannot be overstated in understanding Dennis's subsequent development. The validation he received from successfully planning and executing the Otero killings without immediate detection provided him with enormous confidence in his abilities while confirming his belief in his intellectual superiority over law enforcement. This success served as proof of concept for his criminal methodology and encouraged him to continue refining his techniques. Dennis's approach to developing his criminal methodology was remarkably systematic and professional in nature. Rather than acting impulsively or emotionally, he treated each subsequent crime as an opportunity to test improvements to his procedures and gather intelligence about law enforcement responses. This analytical approach to murder reveals the cold, calculating nature of his psychology and his ability to view even the most heinous acts as intellectual exercises to be optimized. The evolution of his victim selection criteria demonstrates the sophisticated psychological profiling that Dennis conducted on potential targets. Initially, his criteria were relatively broad, but over time he developed increasingly specific preferences based on factors such as family composition, security arrangements, neighborhood characteristics, and personal vulnerabilities. This refinement process reveals his growing expertise in identifying individuals who would provide maximum satisfaction while presenting minimal risk. Dennis's surveillance techniques became increasingly sophisticated as he gained experience. What began as relatively simple observation evolved into complex, multi-layered intelligence-gathering operations that could span weeks or months. He developed systematic approaches to learning victims' routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and mapping their environments in detail. This evolution demonstrates his commitment to minimizing risk while maximizing his control over each situation. The development of his signature binding techniques represents one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of his methodology evolution. The elaborate rope work and restraint systems he employed served multiple psychological functions. They satisfied his need for control, allowed him to prolong his victim's suffering, and demonstrated his technical expertise. The increasing complexity of these techniques over time reveals his growing confidence and his desire to perfect his craft. Dennis's creation of what he called his hit kit, a collection of tools and materials specifically assembled for his crimes, demonstrates the professional level of preparation he brought to his criminal activities. This kit evolved over time as he identified more effective tools and techniques, revealing his continuous process of improvement and refinement. The psychological significance of maintaining such a kit lies in its representation of his complete commitment to his criminal identity. The communication aspect of Dennis's methodology evolved significantly as he gained experience and confidence. His decision to send letters to police and media outlets claiming responsibility for his crimes reveals important psychological motivations, including his need for recognition, his desire to demonstrate intellectual superiority, and his compulsion to control the narrative surrounding his activities. These communications became increasingly sophisticated and revealing over time. Dennis's adoption of the BTK moniker, standing for bind, torture, kill, represents a crucial psychological development in his criminal evolution. The creation of this identity allowed him to compartmentalize his criminal activities while providing a sense of professional identity and accomplishment. The psychological function of this alter ego was to create psychological distance between his crimes and his civilian persona while satisfying his need for recognition and notoriety. The development of his operational security procedures reveals Dennis's sophisticated understanding of investigative techniques and his commitment to avoiding detection. He implemented elaborate counter-surveillance measures, used multiple escape routes, and developed communication security protocols that demonstrated professional-level tradecraft. These procedures evolved continuously as he learned more about law enforcement capabilities and adjusted his methods accordingly. Dennis's ability to maintain operational discipline over extended periods demonstrates remarkable psychological control and planning ability. Unlike many serial killers who become increasingly reckless or impulsive over time, Dennis maintained strict adherence to his security procedures and methodological standards throughout his criminal career. This discipline was crucial to his ability to operate undetected for decades. The evolution of his torture and killing techniques reveals disturbing insights into his psychological development and sadistic preferences. Over time, his methods became more elaborate and prolonged, suggesting that his primary satisfaction came not from the act of killing itself, but from the extended period of control and domination that preceded death. This evolution demonstrates the progressive nature of his sadistic impulses. Dennis's development of what psychologists call trophy collection behaviors represents another significant aspect of his methodology evolution. He began taking personal items from crime scenes and victims, not for their monetary value, but for their psychological significance as reminders of his crimes and proof of his power over others. The types of items he collected and how he used them reveals important insights into his psychological needs and motivations. The timing and spacing of Dennis's crimes reveals sophisticated psychological and operational planning. Rather than killing impulsively or frequently, he developed patterns that allowed him to maintain his civilian life while satisfying his criminal impulses. The gaps between crimes were used for surveillance, planning, and psychological preparation, demonstrating his ability to delay gratification in service of more effective criminal operations. Dennis's ability to learn from near misses and close calls demonstrates remarkable adaptability and risk management skills. When situations didn't go according to plan or when he encountered unexpected complications, he was able to adjust his methodology to prevent similar problems in future crimes. This learning ability was crucial to his long-term success as a predator. The development of his disposal and cleanup procedures reveals important aspects of his criminal methodology and psychological state. Dennis was meticulous about eliminating evidence and minimizing traces of his presence at crime scenes. This attention to detail was driven both by his desire to avoid detection and by his psychological need for perfection and control over every aspect of his criminal operations. Dennis's integration of his professional knowledge into his criminal methodology represents one of his most significant advantages as a predator. His work in security systems provided him with detailed knowledge of how people protect themselves, while his studies in criminal justice gave him insights into investigative procedures. He systematically incorporated this knowledge into his criminal planning, creating significant advantages over law enforcement. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from successfully implementing and refining his methodology was complex and multifaceted. Beyond the immediate gratification from his crimes, he also experienced satisfaction from the intellectual challenge of continuous improvement, the sense of professional accomplishment from successful operations, and the knowledge that he was operating at a level of sophistication that law enforcement couldn't match. Dennis's development of contingency planning and risk mitigation strategies demonstrates the systematic approach he brought to criminal activity. He developed multiple backup plans for various scenarios, identified potential problems before they occurred, and created procedures for handling unexpected complications. This level of planning reveals both his intelligence and his deep psychological commitment to his criminal activities. The evolution of his psychological relationship with his crimes reveals important insights into his developing criminal identity. Over time, Dennis became increasingly invested in his reputation as BTK and in the intellectual challenge of outwitting law enforcement. His crimes became not just expressions of his sadistic impulses, but also statements of his intellectual superiority and professional competence. Dennis's ability to maintain quality control over his criminal operations demonstrates remarkable psychological discipline. Unlike many serial killers whose crimes become increasingly disorganized or reckless over time, Dennis maintained consistent standards of planning, execution, and security throughout his criminal career. This consistency was crucial to his ability to avoid detection while satisfying his psychological needs. The development of his post-crime procedures reveals important aspects of his psychological state and operational methodology. Dennis had elaborate routines for returning to normal life after committing crimes, including specific steps for disposing of evidence, establishing alibis, and managing his psychological state. These procedures allowed him to seamlessly transition between his criminal and civilian identities without detection. Dennis's continuous refinement of his victim interaction techniques demonstrates his growing expertise in psychological manipulation and control. Over time, he became increasingly skilled at managing victims' behavior, prolonging their suffering, and maintaining complete dominance over the situation. This skill development reveals the progressive nature of his sadistic expertise and his commitment to perfecting his craft. The integration of technology into Dennis's criminal methodology reveals his adaptability and commitment to staying current with available tools. As new technologies became available, he incorporated them into his surveillance, communication, and operational procedures. This technological adaptation was crucial to maintaining his effectiveness as investigative capabilities evolved. Dennis's development of what could be called a criminal doctrine, a systematic philosophy and approach to his illegal activities, represents the culmination of his methodological evolution. This doctrine incorporated lessons learned from each crime, intelligence about law enforcement capabilities, and psychological insights about victim behavior. The existence of such a comprehensive approach demonstrates the professional level of his criminal operations. Dennis Rader's approach to victim selection represents one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of his criminal behavior, demonstrating a level of sophistication and systematic thinking that set him apart from impulsive killers. His targeting psychology evolved over decades, incorporating complex criteria that balanced his psychological needs with operational security requirements. Understanding his victim selection process provides crucial insights into how intelligent predators identify and acquire targets while minimizing their risk of detection. The foundation of Dennis's victim selection psychology was rooted in his fundamental need for control and domination over others. Unlike killers who select victims based primarily on opportunity or convenience, Dennis sought targets who would provide maximum psychological satisfaction through their vulnerability and his ability to exert complete power over them. This psychological driver influenced every aspect of his targeting criteria and selection process. Dennis's early victim selection criteria were relatively broad, but revealed important psychological preferences that would persist throughout his criminal career. He was initially drawn to families with children, particularly situations where he could control multiple victims simultaneously. This preference reflected his desire for complex scenarios that would allow him to demonstrate his power over multiple helpless individuals while creating maximum fear and suffering. The psychological significance of Dennis selecting entire families rather than individual victims reveals important aspects of his sadistic psychology. Families represented more complex control scenarios that satisfied his need for intellectual challenge while providing multiple opportunities to inflict psychological trauma. The presence of children in his target families was particularly significant, as it allowed him to exploit the protective instincts of parents and create additional layers of psychological torture. Dennis's professional knowledge and legitimate access played crucial roles in his victim selection process. His work installing security systems provided him with unprecedented access to potential victims' homes and detailed knowledge of their security arrangements, family compositions, and daily routines. This legitimate access eliminated many of the risks typically associated with victim surveillance and selection, while providing him with intelligence that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain through other means. The evolution of Dennis's targeting criteria over time reveals his growing sophistication and his ability to learn from experience. Initially, his selections were influenced primarily by opportunity and basic psychological preferences. However, as he gained experience and confidence, his criteria became increasingly refined and specific, incorporating lessons learned from previous crimes and intelligence about law enforcement capabilities. Dennis's development of what could be called victim profiling techniques demonstrates remarkable psychological insight and predatory intelligence. He learned to identify subtle indicators of vulnerability, isolation, and security weakness that might not be apparent to casual observers. This profiling ability allowed him to select targets who were most likely to provide satisfaction while presenting minimal risk of detection or resistance. The geographical aspects of Dennis's victim selection reveal important psychological and operational considerations. He initially focused on victims within his immediate area, allowing him to leverage his local knowledge and professional connections. However, over time he expanded his geographical range as he gained confidence and sought to reduce the risk of pattern recognition by law enforcement. This geographical evolution demonstrates his strategic thinking and risk management capabilities. Dennis's psychological relationship with his potential victims began long before any criminal contact occurred. His extensive surveillance and stalking activities created an intimate, albeit one-sided, relationship where he knew detailed information about their lives, routines, and vulnerabilities while remaining completely unknown to them. This asymmetrical relationship satisfied his need for power and control while building psychological investment in his eventual crimes. The seasonal and temporal aspects of Dennis's victim selection reveal additional insights into his psychological state and operational planning. He demonstrated clear preferences for certain times of year and times of day that reflected both his psychological needs and his operational requirements. These temporal patterns were influenced by factors such as his work schedule, family obligations, and law enforcement activity levels. Dennis's ability to maintain multiple potential targets simultaneously demonstrates remarkable psychological discipline and organizational skills. Rather than focusing obsessively on a single target, he often maintained surveillance on several potential victims, allowing him to select the optimal target based on changing circumstances and opportunities. This approach reduced his risk while maximizing his options for satisfying his psychological needs. The psychological criteria Dennis used to evaluate potential victims were complex and multifaceted, incorporating both emotional and practical considerations. He was drawn to targets who appeared vulnerable, isolated, or defenseless, but he also evaluated practical factors such as security arrangements, neighborhood characteristics, and potential witness situations. This combination of psychological and operational criteria created a sophisticated targeting methodology. Dennis's fascination with the daily routines and personal habits of his potential victims reveals important aspects of his voyeuristic psychology and his need for complete knowledge and control. He would spend weeks or months learning intimate details about targets' lives, creating detailed mental profiles that satisfied his voyeuristic impulses while providing operational intelligence for potential crimes. The role of fantasy in Dennis's victim selection process was crucial to understanding his psychological motivations. He would often develop elaborate fantasy scenarios involving potential targets long before deciding whether to actually commit crimes against them. These fantasies served multiple psychological functions, providing immediate gratification while allowing him to mentally rehearse potential crimes and evaluate their feasibility. Dennis's ability to compartmentalize his relationships with potential victims demonstrates the sophisticated psychological mechanisms he used to maintain his civilian persona while planning violent crimes. He could interact professionally or socially with potential targets while simultaneously conducting surveillance and planning their murders. This compartmentalization ability was crucial to his long-term success as a predator. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from the victim selection process was significant in itself, separate from any actual criminal activity. The surveillance, planning, and fantasy development associated with targeting provided him with ongoing gratification while building anticipation for potential future crimes. This psychological reward system helped sustain his criminal activities over extended periods. Dennis's development of backup and contingency targets reveals his strategic approach to victim selection and his commitment to maintaining operational security. Rather than becoming fixated on specific individuals, he maintained multiple options that allowed him to adjust his plans based on changing circumstances. This flexibility was crucial to avoiding detection while satisfying his psychological needs. The psychological impact of Dennis's professional interactions with some of his eventual victims creates particularly disturbing insights into his targeting psychology. His legitimate access to homes and families through his security work meant that some of his victims had actually invited him into their homes and trusted him with their safety. This betrayal of professional trust satisfied his psychological need for deception and superiority while providing perfect cover for his criminal activities. Dennis's ability to evaluate and dismiss potential targets who didn't meet his criteria demonstrates remarkable psychological discipline and strategic thinking. Not every potential victim he surveilled became an actual target, revealing his ability to maintain standards and resist impulsive actions. This selectivity was crucial to his operational security and long-term success. The psychological significance of Dennis's preference for victims who were unaware of being targeted reveals important aspects of his control psychology. He derived particular satisfaction from having complete knowledge about people who remained oblivious to his attention and intentions. This asymmetrical awareness created a sense of intellectual and psychological superiority that was central to his criminal gratification. Dennis's integration of victim selection into his normal daily routine demonstrates the sophisticated compartmentalization that characterized his entire criminal career. He could conduct surveillance activities while appearing to engage in completely normal professional or personal activities. This integration was crucial to maintaining his cover while satisfying his psychological needs for ongoing criminal engagement. The evolution of Dennis's victim selection criteria in response to law enforcement activity reveals his adaptive intelligence and strategic thinking. When certain types of targets or geographical areas became associated with increased police attention, he adjusted his criteria accordingly. This adaptability allowed him to continue operating while avoiding the detection patterns that had compromised other serial killers. Dennis's psychological investment in his unchosen targets, potential victims he surveilled but never attacked, reveals additional insights into his targeting psychology. Even victims he never physically harmed were psychologically violated through his surveillance and fantasy activities. This broader impact of his targeting behavior demonstrates the extensive psychological damage caused by his activities beyond his actual murder victims. The role of technology in Dennis's victim selection evolved over time as new surveillance and communication technologies became available. He incorporated innovations such as improved photography equipment, communication devices, and transportation technology into his targeting methodology. This technological adaptation helped maintain his effectiveness as law enforcement capabilities evolved. Dennis's ability to maintain detailed records and intelligence files on potential victims demonstrates both his organizational skills and his psychological investment in the targeting process. These records served multiple functions, providing operational intelligence while satisfying his need for control and his psychological relationship with his targets. The existence of such records also reveals the professional level of his criminal operations. The psychological relationship between Dennis's victim selection and his need for intellectual stimulation reveals important motivations behind his criminal activities. The complex problem-solving required for effective targeting provided ongoing mental engagement that satisfied his need for intellectual challenge while building toward potential criminal satisfaction. This intellectual component was crucial to sustaining his interest in criminal activities over extended periods. Dennis's victim selection psychology ultimately reveals a predator who combines sophisticated intelligence with profound psychological disturbance to create one of the most effective and long-lasting criminal careers in American history. His ability to systematically identify, evaluate, and acquire targets while maintaining perfect operational security demonstrates the dangerous potential of intelligent individuals who lack normal moral constraints and empathetic responses. Dennis Rader's mastery of environmental psychology represents one of his most sophisticated criminal skills, demonstrating how intelligent predators learn to exploit geographical, social, and situational factors to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing detection risks. His understanding of how environmental contexts influence both victim vulnerability and law enforcement response allowed him to operate successfully for decades in the same geographical area without apprehension. The geographical context of Wichita, Kansas provided Dennis with ideal conditions for his criminal activities, though he was skilled enough to have succeeded in almost any environment. Wichita's size created the perfect balance between urban anonymity and suburban predictability, large enough to provide numerous potential targets and sufficient population density to blend in, yet small enough for him to develop comprehensive knowledge of neighborhoods, law enforcement patterns, and social dynamics. Dennis's psychological relationship with his geographical environment was complex and deeply rooted in his need for control and familiarity. Unlike nomadic serial killers who move frequently to avoid detection, Dennis chose to operate primarily within his established territory, where he had extensive knowledge, professional connections, and social credibility. This geographical stability was both a strength and a potential vulnerability that required sophisticated management. The suburban environment of 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds Wichita provided Dennis with optimal hunting grounds that matched his psychological preferences and operational requirements. Suburban neighborhoods offered the perfect combination of family targets, manageable security challenges, and predictable routines that he could study and exploit. The social trust and sense of safety characteristic of suburban communities also worked to his advantage by reducing residents' vigilance and security consciousness. Dennis's professional knowledge of home security systems and neighborhood layouts gave him unprecedented advantages in environmental exploitation. His legitimate work installing alarm systems provided him with detailed knowledge of how different neighborhoods were protected, which areas had the most sophisticated security, and where vulnerabilities existed that could be exploited. This professional intelligence was far more valuable than anything he could have obtained through casual observation. The psychological significance of Dennis operating primarily in his home territory reveals important aspects of his criminal psychology and risk tolerance. Rather than seeking the anonymity of unfamiliar locations, he derived satisfaction from committing crimes in his own community while maintaining his reputation as a respectable citizen. This boldness satisfied his need for intellectual superiority while providing ongoing proof of his ability to deceive those closest to him. Dennis's understanding of law enforcement response patterns and geographical coverage was crucial to his operational success. Through his professional connections and community involvement, he gained detailed knowledge of police patrol routes, response times, and investigative procedures specific to different areas of Wichita. This intelligence allowed him to select locations and timing that minimized his risk of detection or interference. The seasonal and temporal environmental factors played important roles in Dennis's criminal planning and execution. He understood how different times of year affected neighborhood activity levels, police coverage, and resident behavior patterns. Winter months provided longer periods of darkness and reduced outdoor activity, while summer offered more predictable routines but also increased potential witness activity. His ability to exploit these temporal variations demonstrates sophisticated environmental awareness. Dennis's exploitation of architectural and physical environmental factors reveals his detailed understanding of how built environments could be used to his advantage. He preferred homes with specific layout characteristics that provided multiple entry and exit options, limited sight lines from neighboring properties, and architectural features that would aid in controlling victims. This architectural intelligence was far more sophisticated than typical criminal environmental awareness. The social environmental factors in Wichita during Dennis's active period provided him with significant advantages that he skillfully exploited. The community's high levels of social trust, respect for authority figures, and assumption of safety created an environment where his respectable public persona provided excellent camouflage. People were predisposed to trust someone in his professional and social position, reducing their natural vigilance. Dennis's ability to compartmentalize his intimate knowledge of his operating environment demonstrates remarkable psychological sophistication. He could use detailed environmental intelligence for criminal purposes while simultaneously participating normally in the same community as a resident, professional, and church member. This compartmentalization allowed him to exploit his environmental knowledge without arousing suspicion about how he had acquired such detailed information. The psychological comfort Dennis derived from operating in familiar environments was significant to understanding his criminal psychology. Unlike predators who seek the anonymity of unfamiliar territory, Dennis found satisfaction in demonstrating his ability to commit crimes in his own backyard while maintaining his respectable facade. This confidence in his environmental control was both empowering and psychologically gratifying. Dennis's understanding of neighborhood dynamics and social patterns allowed him to predict and exploit human behavior in specific environmental contexts. He knew which neighborhoods had strong community watch programs, which areas had residents who worked unusual hours, and where social isolation might create ideal targeting opportunities. This social intelligence was as valuable as his technical knowledge in enabling his criminal success. The role of transportation infrastructure in Dennis's environmental strategy reveals his sophisticated operational planning. He understood traffic patterns, escape routes, and how different areas of the city were connected or isolated. This knowledge allowed him to plan approaches and retreats that minimized his exposure while maximizing his operational flexibility. His familiarity with backroads, industrial areas, and low-traffic routes provided crucial tactical advantages. Dennis's exploitation of institutional and organizational environmental factors demonstrates his understanding of how social institutions could provide cover for his activities. His involvement with churches, community organizations, and professional associations created environments where his presence was expected and welcome. These institutional affiliations provided both alibis and camouflage while reducing suspicion about his activities. The psychological significance of Dennis's preference for attacking victims in their own homes reveals important environmental and control considerations. Homes represented the ultimate violation of personal space and security, providing maximum psychological impact while offering controlled environments where he could operate without interference. His ability to turn victims' safe spaces into crime scenes satisfied his deepest control and domination needs. Dennis's understanding of how environmental factors affected evidence preservation and recovery demonstrates his sophisticated awareness of forensic considerations. He knew which environmental conditions would help or hinder evidence preservation, how different surfaces and materials might retain traces of his presence, and how weather and time might affect crime scene integrity. This environmental forensic awareness was crucial to his long-term evasion of detection. The economic environmental factors of Wichita during Dennis's active period provided him with additional operational advantages. The city's stable economy and growing population created predictable patterns of residential development and neighborhood evolution. Dennis could anticipate where new potential targets would emerge and how changing economic conditions might affect security consciousness and law enforcement resources. Dennis's ability to exploit seasonal behavioral changes in his target populations reveals sophisticated environmental psychology. He understood how holidays, school schedules, and seasonal activities affected family routines and neighborhood dynamics. This temporal environmental awareness allowed him to identify optimal windows of opportunity while avoiding periods of increased activity or vigilance. The role of technology infrastructure in Dennis's environmental strategy evolved over time as new systems became available. He learned to exploit telephone systems, alarm networks, and communication infrastructure to his advantage while adapting to technological changes that might affect his operational security. His ability to integrate technological environmental factors into his criminal planning demonstrates remarkable adaptability. Dennis's psychological investment in his territorial knowledge created a feedback loop that reinforced his environmental advantages while potentially increasing his risks. His deep familiarity with his operating environment provided confidence and effectiveness, but it also created psychological attachment that made him reluctant to abandon his territory even when investigation pressure increased. This territorial psychology was both a strength and a potential vulnerability. The cultural environmental factors specific to Kansas and the Midwest provided Dennis with additional advantages that he skillfully exploited. The regional culture's emphasis on politeness, trust, and community cooperation created social conditions where his respectable facade was particularly effective. Cultural assumptions about criminal behavior and the types of people who committed violent crimes worked strongly in his favor. Dennis's understanding of how environmental factors affected victim psychology and behavior was crucial to his criminal success. He knew which environmental conditions would increase fear and compliance, how different settings affected victim resistance, and which environmental manipulations could enhance his psychological control. This environmental victim psychology was a key component of his overall methodology. The long-term environmental changes in Wichita during Dennis's criminal career required continuous adaptation of his strategies and techniques. Urban development, population growth, technological advancement, and changing social patterns all affected his operating environment. His ability to adapt to these environmental changes while maintaining his effectiveness demonstrates remarkable criminal sophistication and strategic thinking. Dennis's exploitation of professional and institutional environmental access represents one of his most significant advantages as a predator. His legitimate roles in security, compliance, and community organizations provided him with access to environments and information that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain through other means. This institutional environmental access was crucial to his victim selection and operational planning. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from successfully exploiting his environmental knowledge was significant to understanding his criminal motivation. Beyond the immediate gratification from his crimes, he also experienced satisfaction from demonstrating his environmental mastery and his ability to operate successfully in his own community. This environmental competence was a source of pride and psychological reinforcement that sustained his criminal activities. Dennis's environmental strategy ultimately reveals a predator who understood that successful, long-term criminal operation required mastery of all contextual factors that could affect success or failure. His ability to integrate geographical, social, temporal, architectural, and technological environmental factors into a comprehensive operational strategy demonstrates the sophisticated intelligence that made him one of the most successful serial killers in American history. Dennis Rader's escalation patterns reveal one of the most psychologically complex aspects of his criminal development, demonstrating how intelligent serial killers can simultaneously intensify their behavior while maintaining the operational discipline necessary for long-term evasion. Unlike typical escalation patterns seen in impulsive killers, Dennis's behavioral intensification was controlled, methodical, and strategically managed to balance his growing psychological needs with his commitment to avoiding detection. The traditional understanding of serial killer escalation involves increasing frequency of crimes, decreasing intervals between attacks, and growing recklessness as psychological pressure builds. However, Dennis's escalation pattern defied these conventional models, revealing a more sophisticated form of behavioral intensification that incorporated extended dormancy periods, qualitative rather than quantitative changes, and strategic adaptation to environmental pressures. Dennis's first major escalation occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Otero family murders, when he transitioned from property crimes and voyeuristic activities to multiple homicide. This quantum leap in criminal severity represents one of the most dramatic escalations in serial killer psychology, yet it was followed by a period of relative restraint that lasted several months. This pattern of dramatic escalation followed by strategic pause would characterize his entire criminal career. The psychological drivers behind Dennis's escalation patterns were complex and multifaceted, involving the interplay between his growing confidence, his evolving sadistic preferences, and his intellectual need for increasingly complex challenges. Each successful crime provided validation that encouraged further escalation while also providing learning experiences that informed his strategic planning for future intensification. Dennis's second major crime, the murder of Catherine Bright in April 1974, represented a different type of escalation not in victim count, but in operational boldness and risk tolerance. This attack occurred in broad daylight and involved multiple complications that he had to manage in real time. The successful resolution of these challenges provided him with confidence that he could handle increasingly complex and risky scenarios. The psychological significance of Dennis's ability to maintain extended dormancy periods between crimes reveals sophisticated impulse control and strategic thinking rarely seen in serial killers. Rather than being driven by uncontrollable compulsions, he was able to delay gratification for months or even years when circumstances required restraint. This ability to modulate his criminal activity based on strategic considerations was crucial to his long-term success. Dennis's escalation and communication activities represents another important dimension of his behavioral intensification. His letters to police and media outlets became increasingly elaborate and revealing over time, demonstrating growing confidence in his ability to engage with law enforcement without detection. These communications satisfied his need for recognition while providing intellectual stimulation through the challenge of revealing information without compromising his security. The evolution of Dennis's torture and control techniques reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his escalation patterns. Over time, his methods became more elaborate, prolonged, and psychologically sophisticated. This escalation was driven by his growing understanding of victim psychology and his desire to maximize the psychological impact of his crimes on both victims and survivors. Dennis's escalation in trophy collection and souvenir behavior demonstrates the growing psychological investment he had in his criminal activities. What began as simple item collection evolved into elaborate ritual behaviors involving photography, documentation, and the creation of detailed memorial collections. This escalation satisfied his need for ongoing connection to his crimes while providing psychological reinforcement between active periods. The geographical aspects of Dennis's escalation reveal his growing confidence and expanding comfort zone. Initially confined to his immediate neighborhood, his target selection gradually expanded to encompass a wider geographical area as his confidence grew and his understanding of law enforcement patterns improved. This geographical escalation was carefully managed to avoid creating detectable patterns while satisfying his need for new challenges. Dennis's escalation in pre-crime surveillance and planning activities demonstrates the growing complexity of his criminal methodology. What initially involved relatively simple observation evolved into elaborate intelligence-gathering operations that could span months. This escalation and preparation satisfied his intellectual needs while improving his operational effectiveness and security. The temporal aspects of Dennis's escalation patterns reveal sophisticated psychological and operational planning. Rather than escalating in linear fashion, his behavioral intensification followed complex cycles that incorporated periods of activity, dormancy, and preparation. These cycles were influenced by external factors such as law enforcement activity, personal circumstances, and seasonal considerations. Dennis's escalation in risk-taking behavior was carefully calibrated to balance his growing psychological needs with his commitment to operational security. Rather than becoming recklessly bold, he escalated in ways that incorporated new safety measures and contingency planning. This managed escalation allowed him to satisfy his increasing need for stimulation while maintaining his ability to avoid detection. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from successful escalation created a feedback loop that encouraged further intensification while building his confidence in his ability to manage increasing risks. Each successful escalation provided validation of his criminal competence while creating psychological pressure for even greater challenges in future crimes. Dennis's escalation in victim control and domination techniques reveals the progressive nature of his sadistic psychology. Over time, he developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing victim behavior, prolonging their suffering, and maintaining complete psychological dominance. This escalation was driven by his growing understanding of fear psychology and his desire to perfect his control techniques. The role of fantasy in Dennis's escalation patterns was crucial to understanding his psychological development. His mental rehearsal activities became increasingly elaborate and detailed over time, serving as both preparation for actual crimes and as a form of escalation in themselves. The complexity and intensity of his fantasy life escalated continuously, even during dormant periods when he wasn't committing actual crimes. Dennis's escalation in operational security measures paradoxically accompanied his increasing boldness, demonstrating his sophisticated understanding of risk management. As his crimes became more elaborate and risky, he simultaneously developed more advanced counter-surveillance techniques, communication, security protocols, and evidence elimination procedures. This parallel escalation in both risk and security was crucial to his long-term success. The psychological pressure created by Dennis's escalation patterns required sophisticated management to avoid the breakdown that typically accompanies intensifying criminal behavior. His ability to compartmentalize his escalating criminal identity from his civilian persona became increasingly challenging over time, requiring ever more sophisticated psychological mechanisms to maintain separation. Dennis's escalation in community involvement and public respectability served as both camouflage for his intensifying criminal activities and as a form of psychological escalation in itself. His increasing prominence in church and community organizations provided perfect cover while satisfying his need to demonstrate his ability to deceive those closest to him on an ever larger scale. The communication escalation that characterized Dennis's later criminal period reveals important psychological needs that were becoming increasingly difficult to satisfy through crimes alone. His growing need for recognition and acknowledgement of his criminal achievements led to increasingly risky communication with law enforcement and media, ultimately contributing to his eventual capture. Dennis's escalation in documentation and record-keeping activities demonstrates the growing psychological investment he had in preserving and memorializing his criminal achievements. Over time, he developed elaborate systems for recording his crimes, maintaining victim information, and preserving evidence of his activities. This documentation escalation satisfied his need for ongoing connection to his crimes while creating significant security risks. The technological aspects of Dennis's escalation reveal his commitment to staying current with available tools and techniques. As new technologies became available, he incorporated them into his criminal methodology in increasingly sophisticated ways. This technological escalation helped maintain his effectiveness as law enforcement capabilities evolved. Dennis's escalation in manipulation and deception skills extended beyond his criminal activities to encompass his entire social and professional life. Over time, he became increasingly skilled at managing multiple personas, maintaining complex deceptions, and manipulating social situations to his advantage. This social escalation was crucial to maintaining his cover as his criminal activities intensified. The psychological cost of Dennis's escalation patterns eventually began to create pressures that would contribute to his eventual capture. The increasing complexity of managing his escalating criminal identity while maintaining his civilian facade created stress and opportunities for mistakes that had not existed during earlier, simpler periods of his criminal career. Dennis's escalation in victim impact and community terror represents the broader societal dimension of his behavioral intensification. Over time, his crimes had increasingly significant impacts on community psychology, law enforcement resources, and public safety consciousness. This escalation in societal impact satisfied his need for recognition while creating increasing pressure for his apprehension. The ultimate escalation in Dennis's criminal career was his transition from active crime commission to what could be called legacy management, his increasing focus on ensuring his criminal achievements would be recognized and remembered. This final escalation phase involved increasing risks to maintain his connection to his criminal identity, ultimately leading to the mistakes that enabled his capture. Dennis's escalation patterns ultimately reveal a predator whose criminal development was characterized by sophisticated psychological management of intensifying needs and behaviors. His ability to escalate his criminal activities while maintaining operational discipline for decades demonstrates both the terrifying potential of intelligent criminals and the importance of understanding escalation patterns in predicting and preventing future crimes. Dennis Rader's psychological relationship with law enforcement represents one of the most complex and revealing aspects of his criminal psychology, demonstrating how intelligent predators can transform the traditional adversarial relationship between criminals and police into a sophisticated psychological game that satisfies multiple needs while providing operational advantages. His interaction with investigators reveals a mind that viewed law enforcement not as a threat to be avoided, but as an audience to be impressed and opponents to be intellectually dominated. The foundation of Dennis's investigation psychology was rooted in his academic background in criminal justice and his professional connections to law enforcement and security communities. This legitimate knowledge base provided him with unprecedented insights into investigative procedures, evidence collection techniques, and law enforcement psychology that he systematically exploited throughout his criminal career. His understanding of how investigations functioned allowed him to stay several steps ahead of those pursuing him. Dennis's decision to actively communicate with law enforcement through letters and packages represents a profound psychological need that went far beyond typical criminal behavior. These communications satisfied multiple psychological functions. They provided recognition for his criminal achievements, demonstrated his intellectual superiority over investigators, and allowed him to control the narrative surrounding his crimes. Most importantly, they satisfied his need for ongoing engagement with his criminal identity during dormant periods. The psychological sophistication of Dennis's communication strategy reveals remarkable understanding of investigative psychology and media dynamics. His letters were carefully crafted to provide enough information to maintain credibility and generate publicity while avoiding details that might compromise his operational security. This balance required sophisticated understanding of what investigators needed versus what they could use to identify him. Dennis's ability to observe law enforcement responses to his crimes while maintaining his civilian persona provided him with invaluable psychological intelligence about investigative capabilities and limitations. Through his professional connections and community involvement, he could monitor investigation progress, assess law enforcement morale, and identify procedural weaknesses that he could exploit in future crimes. This inside perspective was one of his greatest advantages as a predator. The psychological satisfaction Dennis derived from his communication with law enforcement reveals important aspects of his narcissistic psychology and his need for intellectual validation. Each response to his letters, each news conference, and each investigative development provided him with evidence that he was worthy of serious attention from professional investigators. This validation was crucial to maintaining his psychological investment in his criminal identity. Dennis's understanding of how media coverage affected both public psychology and law enforcement response allowed him to manipulate both audiences through his communications. He learned to provide information that would generate the type of coverage he desired while creating pressure on investigators to respond in ways that satisfied his psychological needs. This media manipulation was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. The evolution of Dennis's communication style over time reveals his growing confidence and his increasing psychological investment in his interaction with law enforcement. His early communications were relatively simple and straightforward, but over time they became more elaborate, detailed, and psychologically revealing. This evolution demonstrates his growing comfort with the risks associated with communication and his increasing need for complex interaction. Dennis's ability to compartmentalize his knowledge of investigation procedures from his civilian interactions with law enforcement demonstrates remarkable psychological sophistication. He could maintain normal professional and social relationships with police officers and security personnel while simultaneously using his knowledge of their procedures to evade their investigative efforts. This compartmentalization was crucial to maintaining his cover. The psychological impact of Dennis's communications on law enforcement reveals important insights into investigator psychology and the challenges of pursuing intelligent criminals. His letters created psychological pressure on investigators while providing tantalizing clues that were difficult to resist pursuing. This dynamic allowed him to influence investigation priorities and resource allocation while maintaining control over the timing and nature of information disclosure. Dennis's understanding of forensic limitations and investigative constraints during his active period provided him with significant advantages in avoiding detection. His knowledge of evidence collection procedures, laboratory capabilities, and investigative timelines allowed him to plan his crimes in ways that minimized useful evidence while maximizing investigative challenges. This forensic awareness was far more sophisticated than typical criminal understanding. The psychological chess game that developed between Dennis and law enforcement over decades represents one of the most complex predator-investigator relationships in criminal history. Each side's moves influence the other's strategy, creating a dynamic interaction that satisfied Dennis's intellectual needs while challenging investigators in unprecedented ways. This ongoing engagement became central to Dennis's psychological relationship with his criminal identity. Dennis's ability to maintain his communication with law enforcement while avoiding detection required sophisticated operational security and psychological discipline. Each communication created risks that had to be carefully managed through elaborate precautions and counter-surveillance measures. His success in maintaining this communication channel for years demonstrates remarkable criminal sophistication. The role of technology in Dennis's communication strategy evolved over time as new methods became available. He adapted his communication techniques to incorporate new technologies while maintaining security protocols that protected his identity. This technological evolution demonstrates his commitment to staying current with available tools while managing the associated risks. Dennis's psychological relationship with individual investigators reveals his ability to develop personal connections and rivalries that transcended the typical criminal law enforcement dynamic. He seemed to view certain investigators as worthy opponents whose professional capabilities he respected, creating a complex psychological dynamic that combined competition with a twisted form of professional appreciation. The intelligence value of Dennis's position within the community provided him with ongoing access to information about investigation progress and law enforcement capabilities. Through his professional connections, church involvement, and community activities, he could monitor investigation developments while appearing to be a concerned citizen interested in public safety. This intelligence access was crucial to his long-term evasion success. Dennis's understanding of law enforcement psychology allowed him to predict and manipulate investigative responses to his communications and crimes. He learned to anticipate how different types of information would affect investigator behavior and public response, allowing him to orchestrate outcomes that satisfied his psychological needs while maintaining his operational security. The psychological pressure that Dennis's communications created within law enforcement organizations reveals the broader impact of his investigation psychology on institutional functioning. His ability to generate publicity and public pressure while remaining undetected created stress within investigative teams that affected morale, resource allocation, and strategic decision-making. Dennis's exploitation of interagency dynamics and jurisdictional complexities demonstrates sophisticated understanding of law enforcement organizational psychology. He learned to exploit communication gaps, jurisdictional limitations, and competitive dynamics between different agencies to his advantage. This organizational intelligence was as valuable as his technical knowledge in enabling his long-term success. The psychological significance of Dennis's ability to attend community meetings and public forums where his crimes were discussed reveals the sophisticated compartmentalization that characterized his entire criminal career. He could participate in discussions about his own crimes while appearing to be a concerned citizen, satisfying his psychological need to be close to his criminal legacy while maintaining perfect camouflage. Dennis's development of what could be called investigative countermeasures demonstrates his systematic approach to neutralizing law enforcement advantages. He developed procedures for monitoring investigation progress, assessing threats to his security, and adapting his methodology based on law enforcement developments. This counterintelligence capability was crucial to his operational longevity. The psychological relationship between Dennis's legitimate security work and his criminal activities created complex dynamics that affected both his criminal methodology and his interaction with law enforcement. His professional knowledge of security systems and investigative procedures provided legitimate explanations for suspicious knowledge while giving him insights that enhanced his criminal effectiveness. Dennis's ability to maintain his communication with law enforcement during extended dormancy periods reveals important psychological needs that transcended his actual crime commission. Even when he wasn't actively killing, he needed ongoing connection to his criminal identity and validation of his criminal achievements. These communications satisfied these needs while maintaining his psychological investment in his criminal persona. The evolution of Dennis's investigation psychology over time reveals his growing psychological dependence on his interaction with law enforcement for identity validation and intellectual stimulation. What began as tactical communication gradually became a psychological necessity that ultimately contributed to his eventual capture when his need for engagement overcame his security discipline. Dennis's understanding of how statute of limitations and cold case procedures affected investigation priorities allowed him to make strategic decisions about communication, timing, and content. He knew which crimes remained active priorities and which had been relegated to cold case status, allowing him to reveal information in ways that satisfied his psychological needs while minimizing immediate investigative pressure. The psychological sophistication of Dennis's evidence management and crime scene manipulation reveals his deep understanding of forensic procedures and investigative priorities. He knew what types of evidence would be most valuable to investigators and could manipulate crime scenes to provide misleading or confusing information that would complicate investigation efforts. Dennis's investigation psychology ultimately reveals a predator who transformed the traditional cat-and-mouse dynamic between criminals and law enforcement into a complex psychological relationship that satisfied his intellectual and narcissistic needs while providing operational advantages. His ability to maintain this relationship for decades while avoiding detection demonstrates both his criminal sophistication and the challenges facing law enforcement when pursuing intelligent adversaries who understand investigative psychology as well as their pursuers. The capture of Dennis Rader in 2005 represents one of the most psychologically revealing conclusions to a serial killer career in criminal history, demonstrating how even the most sophisticated and disciplined predators can ultimately be undone by the very psychological needs that drove their criminal behavior. His downfall was not the result of investigative breakthroughs or forensic advances, but rather the inevitable consequence of psychological pressures that had been building for decades and finally overcame his legendary operational discipline. The psychological foundation of Dennis's eventual capture was established years before his actual apprehension, rooted in his fundamental need for recognition and validation of his criminal achievements. After years of dormancy following his last murder in 1991, Dennis found himself increasingly unable to satisfy his psychological needs through passive connection to his criminal identity. The absence of active investigation, attention, and media coverage created a psychological vacuum that demanded to be filled. The triggering event that initiated Dennis's path to capture was the 2004 publication of a book about the BTK case by a local journalist. The book's coverage of his crimes and their impact on the community reactivated his dormant psychological needs while highlighting how his criminal legacy was being interpreted and remembered. His reaction to this book reveals the extent to which his identity had become dependent on external validation of his criminal achievements. Dennis's decision to resume communication with law enforcement after more than a decade of silence represents a critical psychological threshold where his need for engagement finally overcame his security discipline. This decision was driven by complex psychological factors including his aging process, his desire to correct perceived inaccuracies about his crimes, and his fear that his criminal legacy might be forgotten or misrepresented. The psychological pressure to re-engage had become irresistible. The psychological sophistication that had protected Dennis for decades began to work against him as his communication needs intensified. His elaborate security protocols and operational discipline, which had been assets during his active criminal period, became barriers to the recognition and engagement he desperately craved. This created internal psychological conflict between his security consciousness and his identity validation needs. Dennis's communication strategy during his final active period reveals important changes in his psychological state and risk assessment capabilities. His messages became more frequent, more detailed, and more personally revealing than his earlier communications. This escalation reflected both his growing desperation for engagement and his declining ability to maintain the psychological discipline that had previously protected him from detection. The technological aspects of Dennis's downfall demonstrate how rapidly evolving technology can compromise even sophisticated operational security systems. His decision to use digital communication methods, particularly computer disks, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of digital forensics capabilities that had developed during his dormant period. This technological gap between his knowledge and current capabilities created the vulnerability that enabled his identification. The psychological irony of Dennis's capture lies in the fact that his greatest strength, his intelligence and sophistication, ultimately contributed to his downfall. His complex communication needs and his desire to demonstrate his intellectual superiority led him to take risks that simpler criminals would have avoided. His psychological sophistication created expectations and needs that could not be satisfied through simple, secure methods. Dennis's specific mistake with the computer disk that led to his identification reveals important psychological factors that influenced his risk assessment during this period. His question to investigators about whether computer disks could be traced, and his acceptance of their deliberately misleading response, demonstrates how his psychological need for engagement compromised his normally excellent judgment about operational security. The psychological dynamics of Dennis's interactions with investigators during his final communication period reveal his growing psychological dependence on this relationship for identity validation. His communications became increasingly personal and revealing, suggesting that he was unconsciously seeking deeper engagement that would ultimately require his exposure. This psychological progression toward disclosure was largely unconscious but psychologically inevitable. Dennis's creation and inclusion of increasingly detailed evidence in his communications demonstrates his growing psychological need to prove his criminal achievements beyond doubt. His inclusion of photographs, documents, and personal items from victims reflected both his desire for recognition and his unconscious movement toward full disclosure. These evidence releases were psychologically significant as they represented his growing willingness to sacrifice security for validation. The role of aging in Dennis's psychological deterioration and eventual capture reveals important factors that affect long-term serial killer psychology. As he entered his 60s, psychological factors including mortality awareness, legacy concerns, and declining cognitive flexibility began to affect his decision-making processes. His aging psychology created pressures for resolution and recognition that overcame his security discipline. Dennis's psychological relationship with his community identity during his final period created additional pressures that contributed to his exposure. His prominent roles in church and community organizations provided ongoing validation of his civilian persona, but they also created psychological conflict with his need for criminal recognition. This identity conflict intensified as he aged and became increasingly concerned about how he would be remembered. The psychological significance of Dennis's decision to include a computer disk in his communication package reveals the complex interaction between his technological confidence and his psychological needs. His belief that he could safely use digital technology reflected both his overconfidence in his abilities and his growing willingness to accept risks in pursuit of engagement. This decision represents the psychological tipping point where need overcame discipline. Dennis's reaction to being identified through the computer disk metadata reveals important aspects of his psychological state during the final stages of his criminal career. Rather than attempting to flee or destroy evidence, he seemed to experience a form of psychological relief that his long period of concealment was ending. This reaction suggests that the psychological burden of maintaining his dual identity had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The psychological preparation that Dennis had unconsciously undertaken for his eventual exposure became apparent in the aftermath of his identification. His detailed record keeping, evidence preservation, and documentation of his crimes suggest that he had been unconsciously preparing for eventual disclosure throughout his criminal career. This preparation reveals the psychological conflict between his need for secrecy and his desire for recognition. Dennis's behavior during the investigation following his identification demonstrates remarkable psychological compartmentalization, even under extreme stress. His ability to maintain his civilian persona and continue his normal activities while knowing that his criminal identity was being investigated reveals the sophisticated psychological mechanisms he had developed over decades of living a double life. The psychological dynamics of Dennis's decision to confess rather than attempt to fight the charges reveal important aspects of his psychological state and his relationship with his criminal identity. His confession represented not just an acknowledgement of guilt, but a psychological liberation that allowed him to finally integrate his criminal and civilian identities. This integration had been his unconscious goal throughout his final communication period. Dennis's detailed confession and his willingness to provide comprehensive information about his crimes reveal his psychological need to ensure that his criminal achievements were fully documented and understood. His cooperation with investigators satisfied his long-suppressed need for recognition while providing him with a final opportunity to demonstrate his criminal sophistication and intelligence. The psychological impact of exposure on Dennis's sense of identity reveals the complex relationship between his criminal and civilian personas. Rather than experiencing psychological collapse or denial, he seemed to experience relief at no longer having to maintain the exhausting compartmentalization that had characterized his entire adult life. His exposure allowed for psychological integration that had been impossible during his criminal career. Dennis's psychological adaptation to his changed circumstances following exposure demonstrates remarkable flexibility and his ability to derive satisfaction from new forms of attention and engagement. His interactions with investigators, psychologists, and media representatives provided alternative sources of the recognition and intellectual engagement that had previously been satisfied through his criminal activities and covert communications. The role of family psychology in Dennis's exposure reveals additional factors that influenced his final period risk-taking. His relationships with his wife and children created psychological pressures regarding his legacy and how his dual identity might affect them. His growing concern about his family's eventual discovery of his criminal identity may have influenced his unconscious movement toward exposure and resolution. Dennis's psychological relationship with the investigative team that captured him reveals his ability to derive satisfaction from professional recognition, even in the context of his criminal exposure. His respect for the investigators' capabilities and his apparent enjoyment of their attention demonstrates how his need for intellectual engagement continued to influence his psychology even after his capture. The broader psychological implications of Dennis's capture methodology reveal important insights about long-term serial killer psychology and the inevitable tensions between operational security and psychological needs. His case demonstrates that even the most sophisticated and disciplined criminals may eventually be undone by the same psychological drives that initially motivated their criminal behavior. Dennis's post-capture psychological state reveals the resolution of decades of psychological conflict between his need for secrecy and his desire for recognition. His apparent psychological stability following exposure suggests that the integration of his dual identity, even in the context of criminal prosecution, provided psychological relief from the exhausting maintenance of his long-term deception. The psychological lessons from Dennis's capture extend beyond his individual case to provide insights into the vulnerabilities that may affect other long-term offenders. His experience demonstrates that psychological needs for recognition, validation, and legacy management can ultimately overcome even the most sophisticated operational security measures when they remain unsatisfied for extended periods. Dennis's capture ultimately represents the psychological inevitability of exposure for criminals whose identity and self-worth become dependent on external validation of their criminal achievements. His case demonstrates that the very psychological traits that enable sophisticated long-term criminal careers may also contain the seeds of their own destruction when those needs can no longer be satisfied through covert means. Dennis Rader's behavior during the legal proceedings following his capture provides extraordinary insights into his psychology under extreme stress and his adaptation to the formal structures of the criminal justice system. His interactions with investigators, attorneys, and court personnel reveal a mind that continued to seek control and intellectual validation even when facing the complete collapse of his carefully constructed dual identity and the certainty of life imprisonment. The initial interrogation period following Dennis's arrest demonstrated his remarkable psychological preparation for eventual exposure and his sophisticated understanding of legal procedures, rather than exhibiting the panic or denial typical of captured serial killers. Dennis approached his interrogation with what appeared to be genuine relief mixed with professional curiosity about the investigative process that had led to his identification. This reaction suggests that he had been psychologically preparing for this moment for years. Dennis's decision to waive his Miranda rights and speak extensively with investigators reveals important psychological motivations that extended far beyond simple cooperation. His willingness to provide detailed confessions satisfied multiple psychological needs. It demonstrated his intellectual superiority, provided recognition for his criminal achievements, and allowed him to control the narrative of his capture and crimes. Most importantly, it satisfied his long-suppressed need for complete honesty about his criminal identity. The psychological dynamics of Dennis's confession process reveal his sophisticated understanding of both investigative psychology and his own psychological needs. He approached his confessions systematically, providing information in a carefully structured manner that satisfied investigators' requirements while ensuring that his criminal achievements were properly documented and understood. This methodical approach reflected his lifelong pattern of maintaining control even in chaotic situations. Dennis's detailed descriptions of his crimes during interrogation demonstrate his remarkable memory for criminal details and his psychological investment in accuracy and completeness. His ability to recall specific aspects of crimes committed decades earlier reveals the profound psychological significance these events held for him and the mental rehearsal activities that had kept these memories vivid throughout his dormant periods. The psychological significance of Dennis's cooperation with investigators extends beyond simple confession to represent a form of professional collaboration that satisfied his intellectual needs. His willingness to provide technical details about his methodology, explain his decision-making processes, and offer insights into his psychological state represents an unprecedented level of criminal self-analysis that provided valuable intelligence about sophisticated predator psychology. Dennis's interaction style with investigators reveals his continued need to be perceived as intelligent and competent even in the context of criminal confession. He approached interrogations as opportunities to demonstrate his expertise and sophistication rather than as adversarial encounters to be endured. This attitude reflects his fundamental psychological need for intellectual validation that transcended his circumstances. The legal strategy discussions between Dennis and his attorneys reveal interesting psychological dynamics regarding his relationship with the justice system and his expectations for legal proceedings. His apparent lack of interest in mounting a serious defense suggests that he viewed the legal process more as a formality to be completed than as a genuine adversarial proceeding where his freedom was at stake. Dennis's psychological preparation for his courtroom appearances demonstrates his continued attention to image management and his desire to present himself in a manner consistent with his self-perception as an intelligent, sophisticated individual. His courtroom demeanor reflected careful consideration of how he would be perceived by observers and his desire to maintain dignity and control even in the context of admitting to horrific crimes. The psychological impact of Dennis's detailed crime descriptions during legal proceedings reveals his complex relationship with his criminal legacy and his need for accurate documentation of his achievements. His meticulous recounting of crime details served multiple psychological functions. It ensured historical accuracy, demonstrated his criminal sophistication, and provided him with final opportunities to relive his criminal achievements in a socially acceptable context. Dennis's adaptation to the formal structures and procedures of the legal system demonstrates his remarkable psychological flexibility and his ability to find sources of intellectual engagement even in highly constrained circumstances. He seemed to approach legal proceedings with genuine curiosity about the process and appeared to derive satisfaction from understanding and participating in the formal mechanisms of justice. The psychological dynamics of Dennis's allocution during his sentencing hearing reveal his continued need for control and his desire to shape public perception of his crimes and motivations. His decision to provide detailed descriptions of his crimes in open court satisfied his need for public recognition while allowing him to maintain control over the narrative of his criminal career until the very end. Dennis's interaction with court-appointed mental health professionals reveals his sophisticated understanding of psychological evaluation procedures and his ability to maintain control even during intimate psychological examination. His cooperation with psychological assessments seemed motivated by genuine curiosity about professional psychological opinions regarding his mental state and criminal behavior. The psychological significance of Dennis's apparent lack of remorse or emotional distress during legal proceedings reveals important aspects of his fundamental personality structure and his relationship with his criminal behavior. His calm, business-like approach to admitting and describing horrific crimes demonstrates the profound emotional disconnection that had enabled his criminal career and his ability to compartmentalize even under extreme circumstances. Dennis's management of media attention during his legal proceedings demonstrates his continued sophisticated understanding of public psychology and his desire to control his public image. His careful attention to his appearance and demeanor during televised proceedings reflects his awareness of the historical significance of these events and his desire to be remembered in a manner consistent with his self-perception. The psychological impact of family revelations during Dennis's legal proceedings reveals the complex emotional dynamics that had characterized his dual identity throughout his criminal career. His family's shock and devastation upon learning of his criminal activities provided him with perhaps his first genuine emotional response during the legal process, suggesting that his relationships with family members represented the only authentic emotional connections in his life. The psychological dynamics of Dennis's sentencing phase reveal his adaptation to the reality of life imprisonment and his ability to find psychological satisfaction even in the context of complete loss of freedom. His apparent acceptance of his sentence and his focus on ensuring accurate documentation of his crimes suggests that he had achieved the recognition and legacy preservation that had motivated his final communication period. Dennis's post-sentencing psychological state reveals his successful adaptation to the resolution of his lifelong identity conflict and his ability to derive satisfaction from having finally integrated his criminal and civilian personas. His apparent psychological stability following sentencing suggests that the complete exposure of his criminal identity provided relief from the psychological burden of maintaining his dual life. The broader psychological implications of Dennis's legal behavior reveal important insights into how sophisticated criminals adapt to formal justice procedures and the psychological needs that continue to motivate their behavior even after capture. His case demonstrates that legal proceedings can provide alternative sources of the recognition and intellectual engagement that previously motivated criminal behavior. Dennis's willingness to participate in ongoing psychological studies and interviews during his legal proceedings reveals his continued need for intellectual engagement and his desire to contribute to understanding of criminal psychology. His cooperation with researchers and mental health professionals satisfied his need for intellectual stimulation while providing him with opportunities to demonstrate his self-awareness and analytical capabilities. The psychological evolution of Dennis's attitude toward his crimes during legal proceedings reveals interesting changes in his self-perception and his relationship with his criminal identity. While maintaining pride in his technical expertise, he began to demonstrate limited awareness of the broader impact of his crimes on victims and community, suggesting some evolution in his psychological perspective. Dennis's strategic management of information disclosure during legal proceedings demonstrates his continued need for control and his desire to maintain some level of influence over the process even as a defendant. His careful timing of revelations and his selective cooperation with different aspects of the investigation reflect his sophisticated understanding of information as a source of power and influence. The psychological significance of Dennis's apparent satisfaction with his legal proceedings reveals his success in achieving many of the psychological goals that had motivated his criminal career. His complete confession provided the recognition he had sought. His detailed crime descriptions ensured accurate documentation of his achievements, and his cooperation with investigators satisfied his need for intellectual engagement with worthy opponents. Dennis's legal psychology ultimately reveals a mind that maintained its fundamental character traits and psychological needs even under the extreme circumstances of criminal prosecution. His ability to adapt his sophisticated manipulation and control skills to the formal justice environment demonstrates both his psychological resilience and his continued commitment to maintaining intellectual superiority and personal dignity regardless of circumstances. The conclusion of Dennis's legal proceedings represents the successful resolution of decades of psychological conflict between his need for secrecy and his desire for recognition. His comprehensive confession and cooperation with legal authorities provided him with the complete exposure and validation of his criminal achievements that his psychology had demanded, finally allowing him to achieve the integration of his dual identity that had been the unconscious goal of his entire criminal career. Dennis Rader's adaptation to life in prison represents the final chapter in understanding his complex psychology, revealing how a sophisticated predator who had spent decades maintaining elaborate deceptions and controlling his environment adapted to the complete loss of freedom and the stark reality of permanent incarceration. His prison psychology provides crucial insights into how intelligent criminals cope with the ultimate consequence of their actions while maintaining their fundamental personality structures. The initial psychological shock of transitioning from his carefully controlled civilian life to the harsh reality of maximum security incarceration might have been expected to cause severe psychological distress or breakdown. However, Dennis's adaptation reveals remarkable psychological resilience and his ability to find sources of satisfaction and control even within the most restrictive environment. This adaptability demonstrates the same psychological sophistication that had enabled his criminal career. Dennis's acceptance of his life sentence without possibility of parole demonstrates a psychological maturity and realism that contrasts sharply with many other serial killers who spend years pursuing futile appeals or maintaining elaborate delusions about their eventual release. His pragmatic acceptance of his circumstances allowed him to focus his psychological energy on adapting to his new reality rather than wasting mental resources on impossible fantasies. The psychological significance of Dennis's apparent lack of depression or severe psychological distress during his early incarceration period reveals important aspects of his fundamental personality structure. His ability to maintain psychological stability despite complete loss of freedom suggests that his sense of self-worth was not dependent on external circumstances to the degree typical of most individuals. This psychological independence was both a strength and a reflection of his profound emotional disconnection. Dennis's development of new sources of intellectual stimulation and engagement within the prison environment demonstrates his remarkable adaptability and his continued need for mental challenge. He pursued educational opportunities, engaged with prison programs, and maintained correspondence that provided him with the intellectual engagement that had always been crucial to his psychological well-being. This intellectual adaptation was key to his successful adjustment to incarceration. The social dynamics of Dennis's prison experience reveal interesting aspects of his interpersonal psychology and his ability to manage relationships within the complex social hierarchy of correctional institutions. His reputation as an intelligent, high-profile killer provided him with a certain status among other inmates, while his non-confrontational personality and institutional cooperation helped him avoid many of the conflicts that plague other notorious criminals. Dennis's relationship with correctional staff demonstrates his continued ability to present himself as a model individual while concealing any resentment or hostility he might feel about his circumstances. His courteous, cooperative demeanor with guards and administrators reflects the same impression management skills that had enabled him to maintain his civilian facade for decades while committing horrific crimes. The psychological impact of Dennis's permanent loss of control over his environment represents perhaps the most significant challenge to his fundamental personality structure. Throughout his life, the need for control had been central to his psychology, driving both his legitimate achievements and his criminal behavior. Learning to derive satisfaction from the limited control available in prison required significant psychological adaptation. Dennis's management of his celebrity status within the criminal justice system reveals his continued sophisticated understanding of psychology and his ability to derive satisfaction from recognition even in negative contexts. His willingness to participate in interviews, studies, and documentaries provided him with ongoing sources of attention and intellectual engagement that helped compensate for the restrictions of prison life. The evolution of Dennis's daily routines and personal habits within the prison environment demonstrates his ability to create structure and meaning within highly constrained circumstances. His careful management of his time, his attention to personal appearance and behavior, and his development of regular activities reflect his continued need for order and control expressed within the only domains available to him. Dennis's psychological relationship with his past crimes during incarceration reveals interesting changes in his perspective and emotional connection to his criminal history. While maintaining his detailed memory and apparent pride in his criminal sophistication, prison life seems to have provided him with some psychological distance from the intense emotional investment that had characterized his active criminal period. The role of correspondence and communication in Dennis's prison psychology provides crucial insights into his continued need for intellectual engagement and connection with the outside world. His letters and interviews demonstrate his ongoing articulate communication skills and his ability to maintain sophisticated thought processes despite his isolated circumstances. These communications serve as windows into his psychological state and adaptation process. Dennis's adaptation to the loss of privacy and constant surveillance within the prison environment required significant psychological adjustment for someone who had spent decades maintaining elaborate secrets and carefully controlling his public image. His apparent successful adaptation to this transparency suggests either remarkable psychological flexibility or profound psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to accept circumstances he could not control. The psychological significance of Dennis's apparent lack of violence or disciplinary problems during his incarceration reveals important aspects of his fundamental personality structure and his relationship with aggression. His prison record suggests that his violent behavior was specifically connected to his criminal activities, rather than representing a general inability to control aggressive impulses in other contexts. Dennis's engagement with mental health services and psychological evaluation during his incarceration provides insights into his self-awareness and his continued interest in understanding his own psychology. His cooperation with mental health professionals suggests genuine curiosity about psychological perspectives on his behavior and personality, though it also reflects his continued need for intellectual engagement with educated professionals. The impact of aging on Dennis's prison psychology reveals how the natural psychological changes associated with growing older interact with the unique challenges of long-term incarceration. His adaptation to declining physical health, reduced energy levels, and increasing awareness of mortality demonstrates his continued psychological resilience and his ability to find meaning and satisfaction despite increasing limitations. Dennis's relationship with his criminal legacy during his prison years reveals his continued investment in how his crimes and criminal career are understood and remembered. His selective participation in documentaries and interviews demonstrates his ongoing desire to shape the narrative of his criminal career while maintaining some control over his public image and historical legacy. The psychological implications of Dennis's complete separation from his family during incarceration represent perhaps the most emotionally significant aspect of his prison experience. His wife's divorce and his children's rejection created a permanent loss that affected him more profoundly than the loss of freedom itself, suggesting that these relationships represented his only authentic emotional connections. Dennis's adaptation to the monotony and routine of prison life required him to develop new sources of psychological stimulation and satisfaction. His engagement with reading, writing, and educational programs provided intellectual outlets that helped prevent the psychological deterioration that affects many long-term inmates. This intellectual engagement was crucial to maintaining his psychological stability. The social psychology of Dennis's interactions with other high-profile criminals within the prison system reveals interesting dynamics of mutual recognition and respect among individuals who represent the extreme end of criminal behavior. These relationships provided him with social connections that understood his unique circumstances while offering intellectual conversation unavailable elsewhere in the prison environment. Dennis's psychological management of the reality that he would never again experience freedom required him to find sources of meaning and satisfaction that were completely internal and independent of external circumstances. His apparent success in this psychological adaptation demonstrates remarkable mental resilience and his ability to derive satisfaction from intellectual and philosophical pursuits rather than external achievements. The role of routine and structure in Dennis's prison adaptation reveals his continued need for order and predictability in his environment. His careful adherence to prison schedules and his development of personal routines demonstrate his ability to create psychological comfort through familiar patterns, even within the chaotic and unpredictable environment of correctional institutions. Dennis's psychological relationship with his notoriety and public attention during his incarceration provides insights into how his narcissistic needs adapted to his changed circumstances. His continued ability to attract media attention and public interest satisfied his need for recognition while providing him with a sense of continued relevance and importance despite his complete removal from society. The long-term psychological implications of Dennis's prison adaptation reveal important insights into the resilience of fundamental personality structures even under extreme circumstances. His ability to maintain his essential psychological characteristics while adapting to radical changes in his life circumstances demonstrates both the stability of core personality traits and the remarkable human capacity for adaptation. Dennis's prison psychology ultimately reveals a mind that maintained its fundamental sophistication and complexity even under the most restrictive circumstances imaginable. His successful adaptation to incarceration demonstrates that the same psychological traits that enabled his criminal career also provided him with the resources necessary to cope with its consequences, creating a form of psychological consistency that spans his entire life experience. The final psychological portrait that emerges from Dennis's incarceration period is that of an individual who achieved a form of resolution and integration that had eluded him throughout his criminal career. His acceptance of his circumstances and his ability to find satisfaction within severe constraints suggests that prison may have provided him with the psychological peace that his complex dual identity had made impossible during his years of freedom. The psychological legacy of Dennis Rader's criminal career extends far beyond his individual crimes, providing crucial insights into the nature of sophisticated predators and fundamentally challenging our understanding of how dangerous individuals can function successfully within society. His case represents a watershed moment in criminal psychology, demonstrating that our traditional models for identifying and preventing serial violence may be inadequate when confronting individuals who possess both criminal intent and exceptional intelligence. The most significant psychological lesson from Dennis Rader's case is the revelation that the most dangerous predators may be those who appear most normal and trustworthy within their communities. His ability to maintain positions of responsibility and trust while committing horrific crimes challenges every assumption we make about recognizing dangerous individuals. This psychological camouflage represents perhaps the most important lesson for both law enforcement and the general public. Dennis's case fundamentally altered our understanding of the relationship between criminal behavior and social functioning, demonstrating that high-level criminal sophistication can coexist with apparent community leadership and moral authority. His roles as church leader, compliance officer, and family man were not merely facades, but represented genuine aspects of his personality that coexisted with his criminal identity through sophisticated compartmentalization. The psychological implications of Dennis's successful decades-long deception extend to broader questions about trust, authority, and social vulnerability. His case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that individuals in positions of trust and authority may exploit those positions for predatory purposes while maintaining perfect public facades. This recognition has profound implications for how we structure security and oversight in vulnerable institutions. The technological aspects of Dennis's eventual capture provide important lessons about the evolving relationship between criminal sophistication and law enforcement capabilities. His downfall through digital forensics demonstrates how rapidly advancing technology can compromise even sophisticated operational security, suggesting that technological evolution may be one of our most powerful tools for identifying long-term offenders who have adapted to traditional investigative methods. Dennis's communication pattern with law enforcement provides crucial insights into the psychological vulnerabilities that may affect other sophisticated criminals. His case demonstrates that the need for recognition and validation may ultimately overcome even exceptional operational discipline, creating opportunities for detection through psychological rather than forensic means. Understanding these psychological pressure points may be key to identifying other long-term offenders. The prevention implications of Dennis's case are both sobering and instructive, highlighting the limitations of traditional prevention strategies while suggesting new approaches based on psychological rather than behavioral indicators. His case demonstrates that effective prevention of sophisticated predators may require understanding psychological development patterns rather than relying solely on behavioral warning signs that intelligent criminals can easily conceal. The psychological profile that emerges from Dennis's case provides a template for understanding how sophisticated predators develop and maintain their criminal careers while avoiding detection. His combination of intelligence, emotional detachment, compartmentalization skills, and need for control creates a psychological pattern that may be applicable to identifying other individuals with similar dangerous potential before they act on their impulses. The institutional implications of Dennis's case extend to questions about how organizations can better protect themselves from sophisticated predators who exploit positions of trust and authority. His ability to use legitimate employment and community involvement as cover for criminal activities suggests that institutions need more sophisticated approaches to screening and monitoring individuals in sensitive positions. The family psychology revealed in Dennis's case provides important insights into how sophisticated predators manage their closest relationships while maintaining their criminal activities. His ability to deceive his wife and children for decades raises difficult questions about the psychological impact on family members and the warning signs that might have been recognizable in hindsight. Understanding these family dynamics may be crucial for prevention efforts. The community impact of Dennis's crimes extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass broader psychological trauma related to the betrayal of trust and the shattering of assumptions about safety and security. His case demonstrates how sophisticated predators can create community-wide psychological damage that persists long after their capture, affecting social cohesion and trust in ways that may never fully heal. The investigative lessons from Dennis's case provide important insights into the challenges of pursuing sophisticated criminals who understand law enforcement procedures and capabilities. His ability to stay ahead of investigators for decades demonstrates the need for new approaches to long-term investigations that incorporate psychological rather than purely forensic strategies. The psychological development patterns evident in Dennis's case provide crucial insights for early intervention and prevention efforts. His childhood and adolescent warning signs, while subtle, were present and might have been recognized and addressed if appropriate screening and intervention protocols had been in place. Understanding these early indicators may be key to preventing similar cases in the future. The role of environmental factors in enabling Dennis's criminal career provides important lessons about how community characteristics can either facilitate or inhibit sophisticated predators. His exploitation of social trust, institutional authority, and community assumptions suggests that certain environmental conditions may create optimal hunting grounds for intelligent criminals. The psychological treatment implications of Dennis's case raise important questions about whether individuals with his psychological profile can be effectively treated or managed through therapeutic intervention. His apparent lack of genuine empathy and his sophisticated deception skills create challenges for traditional therapeutic approaches that rely on authentic engagement and motivation for change. The media psychology surrounding Dennis's case provides insights into how sophisticated criminals may exploit public attention and media coverage to satisfy their psychological needs for recognition and validation. His strategic use of communication with law enforcement and media demonstrates how intelligent predators may use publicity as a form of psychological gratification. The criminal justice implications of Dennis's case extend to questions about how the legal system can effectively process and manage sophisticated criminals who may attempt to manipulate proceedings for their own psychological benefit. His cooperation with investigators and his detailed confessions demonstrate how intelligent criminals may use legal proceedings to achieve recognition and validation rather than as opportunities for redemption or rehabilitation. The long-term social implications of Dennis's case include changes in how communities approach security, trust, and social interaction. His crimes contributed to broader cultural shifts toward increased suspicion, enhanced security measures, and reduced social trust that continue to affect community psychology decades after his capture. The professional implications of Dennis's case extend to how various professions approach screening, monitoring, and oversight of individuals in positions of trust and authority. His exploitation of professional credentials and community standing suggests that traditional professional development and oversight mechanisms may be inadequate for identifying sophisticated predators. The psychological research implications of Dennis's case provide opportunities for advancing our understanding of criminal psychology, particularly regarding the development and maintenance of sophisticated antisocial personalities. His willingness to participate in psychological evaluation and research provides valuable data for understanding how such individuals think and operate. The prevention strategy implications of Dennis's case suggest that effective prevention may require multi-layered approaches that incorporate psychological screening, environmental modification, institutional oversight, and community education. No single prevention strategy would have been sufficient to identify and stop someone with his psychological profile and criminal sophistication. The technological implications of Dennis's case extend to both the opportunities and challenges created by advancing surveillance and forensic capabilities. While technology ultimately enabled his capture, his case also demonstrates how sophisticated criminals can exploit technological limitations and adapt their methods to evolving capabilities. The educational implications of Dennis's case include the need for enhanced training for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and community leaders about recognizing and responding to sophisticated predators. His case provides a wealth of information that can be used to improve professional training and public education about these rare but extremely dangerous individuals. The international implications of Dennis's case extend to global law enforcement cooperation and information sharing about sophisticated criminal methodologies. His techniques and psychological patterns may be applicable to understanding similar cases in other jurisdictions and cultures, contributing to international efforts to identify and apprehend sophisticated predators. The therapeutic implications for victims and survivors of Dennis's crimes provide insights into the unique psychological challenges created by sophisticated predators who violate fundamental assumptions about trust and safety. Recovery from crimes committed by individuals who appear trustworthy and respectable may require specialized therapeutic approaches that address the specific psychological trauma created by such profound betrayal. The ultimate legacy of Dennis Rader's case is the recognition that sophisticated predators represent a unique category of criminal that requires specialized understanding, investigation, and prevention approaches. His case demonstrates that our traditional models for understanding and preventing criminal behavior may be inadequate when confronting individuals who combine criminal intent with exceptional intelligence and social skills. As we conclude this comprehensive analysis of Dennis Rader's psychology, we must acknowledge that his case raises more questions than it answers about the nature of sophisticated criminal behavior and our ability to protect society from such individuals. His legacy serves as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous predators may be those who appear most normal, and that our continued safety depends on developing better understanding of how such individuals develop, operate, and can ultimately be identified and stopped. The psychological journey we have taken through Dennis Rader's mind reveals the terrifying potential of human intelligence when divorced from empathy and moral constraint. His case stands as both a warning about the dangers that may hide behind facades of respectability and a call to action for developing better approaches to identifying and preventing similar tragedies in the future.